They portrayed the future as bright, unified, and full of hope. But behind the scenes, the cast of Star Trek carried struggles that audiences never saw. These weren't just actors stepping into roles, they were real people navigating pressure, doubt, and sacrifice while trying to keep the dream alive. Some of their most unforgettable moments weren't scripted, they were lived. What was hidden behind the bridge of the Enterprise reveals more than drama or gossip. It uncovers the fragile humanity inside a cultural phenomenon. These are the secrets the cast kept buried, until now. Kirk's hidden battle with vanity. He was bold, unshakable, and seemingly ageless, the very image of a fearless space captain. But while Star Trek fans were busy admiring Captain Kirk's commanding presence, the man playing him was quietly fighting a very different battle just out of frame. William Shatner knew exactly what the role demanded. Television in the 1960s wasn't just about delivering lines. It was about maintaining an illusion. Shatner was no stranger to the industry's unspoken rules. If you didn't look the part, you didn't last. As the series progressed, staying camera-ready became a silent struggle. Beneath those iconic gold Starfleet uniforms, he wore a tightly bound girdle to hold in his waistline and preserve the strong, square-jawed silhouette that audiences expected from a leading man. The girdle wasn't just cosmetic, it was a lifeline. Days on set could be grueling, and the compression left him physically uncomfortable. Crew members occasionally joked that he needed to be beamed into it because of how snug it was. But the laughter masked something real. In an era when actors were often discarded the moment their looks faded, Shatner's decision wasn't about vanity. It was about survival. He was simply trying to hold on to a role that had come to define him. Underneath the confidence and charisma was an actor aware of how fragile fame could be. Off camera, he faced the creeping realization that youth doesn't last forever, and that audiences and producers alike often valued appearances over substance. His performance as Captain Kirk required not only emotional energy, but also an unrelenting upkeep of image. An exhausting dual performance, one fictional, the other deeply personal. In time, Shatner would embrace the legacy of Kirk with humor and nostalgia. But during the height of filming, those little adjustments and hidden support spoke volumes. The girdle wasn't just a garment. It was a symbol of the pressure to appear invincible in a world where being human was seen as a liability. And perhaps that quiet contradiction between the flawless captain and the flawed man was exactly what made his performance resonate. The salute that came from the divine. A simple hand gesture became one of the most enduring symbols in all of science fiction. But the Vulcan salute, accompanied by the phrase, "live long and prosper," wasn't crafted by writers or prop designers. It emerged from a deeply personal, even spiritual place that Leonard Nimoy carried with him long before he stepped aboard the Enterprise. During the filming of Amok Time, the first episode to take viewers to Spock's home planet, Nimoy felt that Vulcans needed a ceremonial greeting, something alien, something dignified. Instead of inventing a gesture from scratch, he drew inspiration from a childhood memory that had never left him. In an Orthodox synagogue in Boston, young Nimoy once witnessed a sacred ritual that left a lasting impression. He had been told not to look, but curiosity took over, and what he saw changed everything. 5 men stood with their hands raised, their fingers separated into a peculiar shape, thumb extended, palm forward, and middle and ring fingers parted to form a V. It was a priestly blessing meant to represent the Hebrew letter Shin, a symbol associated with peace and divine protection. The gesture, combined with the haunting chanting in the temple, etched itself into Nimoy's soul. He didn't fully understand it at the time, but he never forgot how it made him feel. Years later, on the Star Trek set, he resurrected that memory. Nimoy proposed the gesture for Spock's people, and the production team went along with it, somewhat bewildered but trusting his instinct. What emerged was far more than a visual quirk. It gave Vulcans a deeper cultural identity. It gave Spock a silent layer of reverence, and it gave the audience a symbol that transcended television. The salute resonated with viewers instantly. Fans began using it in public, mimicking it in photographs, and adopting it in everyday life. Few realized its sacred origin, but that may have been part of its quiet power. It felt futuristic and ancient at the same time, just like Spock himself. For Nimoy, it was a deeply personal victory. He once said, The sound of it and the look of it was magical. By honoring his own heritage, he gave Star Trek a piece of real-world mysticism that made its imagined future feel profoundly human. Uhura nearly walked away. The bridge of the Enterprise symbolized inclusion, intellect, and harmony. But behind the calm exterior, one of its most important cast members was preparing to leave it all behind. Nichelle Nichols had made history as Lieutenant Uhura, a black woman in a position of authority on national television at a time when that kind of representation was almost unheard of. She brought grace, command, and presence to every scene. But the reality behind the camera told a different story. Despite her groundbreaking role, Nichols found her contributions shrinking with each episode. Her lines were minimal, her screen time limited, and she began to feel like little more than set decoration. Disillusioned and deeply frustrated, she made a decision. She would resign from Star Trek and return to her first love, musical theater. She had already drafted her resignation letter and intended to deliver it personally to creator Gene Roddenberry after the weekend. But life had one more scene to play. At a civil rights fundraiser that weekend, Nichols encountered someone she never expected, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. When she introduced herself, he smiled and said he was a devoted fan. Flattered, she confided that she was leaving the show. But his expression changed. Gently but firmly, he told her she couldn't. He explained that Star Trek wasn't just entertainment. It was a vision of a future that people were beginning to believe in. And her presence, he said, was essential to that vision. "You cannot," he told her. "You are a symbol. You are changing the face of television." His words landed with the weight of history. Nichols was stunned. In that moment, she realized that her role wasn't just about scripts or lines. It was about visibility, about possibility, about hope. The following Monday, she returned to the set and quietly withdrew her resignation. From that day forward, she carried her character with renewed purpose. The story has since become legend, passed down at fan conventions, civil rights forums, and television retrospectives. But its emotional truth never fades. One conversation, one weekend, altered the course of her life, and perhaps the perception of what the future could look like for millions of viewers. Uhura stayed, and in doing so, she became not just a communications officer on the Enterprise, but a beacon of change in a time that desperately needed it. Roddenberry's secret affairs on set. A utopian vision of the future beamed into millions of homes each week, showcasing unity, logic, and mutual respect among the stars. But the man who created that vision, Gene Roddenberry, often lived by a very different set of rules when the cameras weren't rolling. Roddenberry was widely praised as a trailblazer. His dream of a peaceful, multi-ethnic future captured the imagination of viewers around the world. But behind the scenes, he was a complicated figure. Charismatic, ambitious, and deeply flawed, he frequently blurred the lines between professional and personal. Several cast members and studio insiders would later reveal that Roddenberry engaged in romantic relationships with multiple women involved in the production, sometimes simultaneously. Two of the most well-known names involved were Majel Barrett and Nichelle Nichols. Barrett, who portrayed Nurse Chapel and later voiced the computer in multiple Star Trek series, was in a long-term relationship with Roddenberry, eventually becoming his wife. Their connection was well known on set. But during the early days of the original series, Roddenberry was also romantically linked with Nichols, an involvement that neither she nor Barrett initially knew about. The atmosphere became even more complex when the truth surfaced. According to Nichols' autobiography, when she discovered that Barrett and Roddenberry were also involved, she confronted the situation with dignity and stepped away. It was a decision that required grace, and perhaps heartbreak. Years later, Nichols and Barrett became close friends, sharing not just a history, but a mutual understanding of what it meant to work beside a man whose brilliance often came wrapped in chaos. Roddenberry's personal life wasn't just a source of tension. It influenced the very foundation of the show. His charisma made him magnetic to colleagues and actors, but it also made him unpredictable. He could be both generous and controlling, visionary and self-indulgent. Some studio executives admired his passion, while privately expressing concern over his erratic behavior. Friends, lovers, and collaborators often found themselves orbiting his ambitions, sometimes burned by the closeness. And yet, without him, there would be no Star Trek. The The tension between Roddenberry's ideals and his impulses is etched into the show's DNA. He imagined a better world, even as he struggled to embody it himself. That contradiction didn't erase his contributions, but it added complexity to them. Behind the noble speeches and starry optimism was a man as human as any of us, grappling with ego, affection, and the burdens of power. In many ways, the flaws he carried helped shape the stories he told. Stories about flawed beings striving for something better. Patrick Stewart never unpacked. The captain's chair demands confidence, poise, and command, but behind that stoic presence in The Next Generation was an actor who didn't even think he'd last the season. When Patrick Stewart accepted the role of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, he wasn't just stepping into the shoes of a new Star Trek leader. He was stepping into what he assumed would be a short, unremarkable detour in his acting career. At the time, Stewart was a classically trained Shakespearean actor, steeped in theatrical tradition, and had only a passing familiarity with American television. He'd taken the job, frankly, out of practicality. He arrived in Los Angeles expecting the show to be canceled quickly. So confident was he in this assumption that he never even unpacked his suitcases. For months, Stewart lived out of hotel rooms, bags by the door, always waiting for the inevitable call that the show had been scrapped and he could return to the London stage. He had told friends it was just a temporary gig, something to tide him over. But something unexpected began to happen. The show found its rhythm, the writing grew stronger, and Stewart began discovering new dimensions in his character. Picard wasn't just a figure of authority. He was layered, philosophical, and deeply human. The cast around him gelled into a cohesive team, and fan response was electric. Still, Stewart hesitated to believe it would last. Eventually, the reality settled in. This wasn't a failed experiment. It was becoming a phenomenon. Over 7 seasons and 4 films, Stewart's portrayal evolved from uncertain placeholder to one of the most respected and beloved captains in Star Trek history. And when he finally unpacked those bags, it wasn't just an admission that the job had stuck. It was a recognition that he had found a new home in a galaxy he once thought he'd leave behind. There's something poetic about Stewart's early doubts. The man who didn't believe he belonged ended up shaping a legacy so profound, it would echo through decades. Fans didn't just admire Captain Picard, they looked up to him. And the actor who almost walked away became a symbol of leadership, diplomacy, and grace under pressure. Sometimes the journeys we try to avoid turn out to be the ones that define us. For Stewart, those packed bags by the door didn't mark an exit. They marked the beginning of something extraordinary. The kiss that shook prime time. Television history is full of small moments that made a big impact, but few were as quietly revolutionary as a single scene on the bridge of the Enterprise, where a kiss was more than just a kiss. It happened during the 1968 episode, Plato's Stepchildren. The plot placed Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura under the control of alien telepaths, forcing them to engage in actions against their will. In the midst of this came what would become the first televised kiss between a white man and a black woman on American network television. The moment was brief, but its significance rippled far beyond the screen. Network executives were immediately nervous. At a time when the country was grappling with deep racial divides, they feared backlash from viewers, especially in the southern states. NBC ordered alternate takes to be filmed, versions where the kiss was implied, avoided, or staged in a way that could be edited out later. But William Shatner and Nichelle Nichols had other ideas. According to both actors, they intentionally sabotaged the alternate takes. In each version where they were supposed to avoid kissing, Shatner crossed his eyes, made faces, or ruined the footage just enough to render it unusable. The only usable footage left was the one where the kiss happened, and so NBC had no choice. The scene aired. What followed wasn't the storm of outrage many feared. Yes, a few stations hesitated, and there were some complaints. But overwhelmingly, viewers embraced the moment, or simply accepted it. The world, it seemed, was more ready for change than the executives had believed. For Nichols, the kiss was both a milestone and a message. She later reflected on how powerful it felt to be part of a scene that challenged long-held boundaries with such quiet defiance. For Shatner, it was a moment of unity between colleagues who trusted each other deeply and understood the responsibility they carried. The kiss wasn't about romance. It wasn't about ratings. It was about presence. It was about being seen. And in a decade defined by protest, progress, and transformation, that one small act on a soundstage in Hollywood became a symbol of what Star Trek always stood for: a better, bolder, more inclusive future. The pain behind the exploding rock. Explosions are nothing new in science fiction, especially aboard starships in alien worlds. But one fiery moment on the set of Star Trek left behind more than just smoke and special effects. It left lasting injuries that the public never saw. The episode was The Apple, a second-season installment of the original series. The plot took the crew of the Enterprise to a mysterious Eden-like planet. In one scene, Spock throws a rock that explodes on contact. It was meant to be a dramatic effect, a controlled burst for visual flair. But what happened instead bordered on disaster. When the special effects crew triggered the explosion, the force was far greater than anyone anticipated. The blast was deafening, jarring the actors who were just feet away. Though they remained in costume, the scene halted abruptly as the cast was rushed for medical attention. The intensity of the detonation caused genuine harm, both immediate and lingering. DeForest Kelley, who played Dr. McCoy, would later reveal that he suffered from a ringing in his ears that never fully went away. Leonard Nimoy also experienced side effects, though less severe. But for William Shatner, who already had hearing issues before filming the series, the explosion made things significantly worse. He developed chronic tinnitus, a persistent internal noise that haunted him for decades. He would later seek treatment through the American Tinnitus Association, becoming a vocal advocate for awareness. What made the incident particularly painful was how avoidable it could have been. On television, the scene passed by in seconds, an exciting burst of action. But the cost to the performers was invisible to the audience. There were no public statements at the time, no press releases about the injuries. Like many moments during the making of Star Trek, it was absorbed, endured, and kept quiet. This moment stands out not because of how spectacular it looked, but because of what it exposed. The boundary between performance and personal risk was thinner than anyone expected. Special effects weren't always predictable, and safety measures, while present, weren't always enough. And yet, the actors returned. They kept filming. They gave everything to a show that asked a lot, and sometimes took even more. When fans look back at The Apple, they see another classic episode. But for those who were there, it's remembered not just for its story, but for the very real scars it left behind. DeForest Kelley could have been Spock. The emotional core of Star Trek often came from the push and pull between cold logic and human compassion, the sharp contrast between Spock and Doctor. McCoy brought tension, humor, and heart to the series, but in a different timeline, that chemistry might never have existed, because DeForest Kelley was originally offered the role of Spock. When Gene Roddenberry was assembling the cast for the original series, he saw something intriguing in Kelley. The actor had a unique ability to project both strength and vulnerability, and Roddenberry believed that combination might be perfect for the role of the Enterprise's half-Vulcan science officer. But Kelley didn't see himself that way. He felt the stoic, expressionless character didn't match his nature as a performer. The part, as conceived, lacked the warmth and fire that he naturally brought to his roles. Kelley turned it down. Instead, Leonard Nimoy stepped into the role that would define his career, and Kelley was later offered the role of Dr. Leonard Bones McCoy. That second offer was a perfect fit. McCoy was passionate, grumpy, deeply empathetic, and fiercely loyal. He became the emotional conscience of the crew, always challenging Spock's logic with a dose of good old-fashioned humanity. The result? One of the most iconic character dynamics in science fiction history. The fiery McCoy, the unflappable Spock, and the commanding Kirk formed a triangle that anchored every story with moral weight and emotional realism. Their philosophical clashes weren't just filler. They were the soul of the show. What makes this behind-the-scenes twist so fascinating is how easily it could have gone another way. Had Kelley accepted the role of Spock, the show would have lost the very dynamic that gave it its heart. It's not that he wouldn't have been capable. It's that his unique emotional range was perfectly suited to a different part, one that became just as iconic. Sometimes, the most important decisions happen in quiet moments. A casting choice reconsidered, a gut feeling followed. In this case, DeForest Kelley's decision not to play Spock gave Star Trek the exact balance it needed. Cold logic on one side, warm defiance on the other, and something unforgettable between them. The Vulcan nerve pinch wasn't in the script. In the high-stakes world of interstellar conflict, action scenes often called for punches, kicks, and dramatic takedowns. But one of Star Trek's most iconic moves, Spock's Vulcan nerve pinch, was born not from choreography, but from an actor's quiet rebellion against convention. During the filming of the episode The Enemy Within, Spock was originally supposed to subdue a duplicate of Captain Kirk with a standard punch to the face. The script called for a physical confrontation, but Leonard Nimoy wasn't convinced. He felt that a character as cerebral and composed as Spock wouldn't resort to something so primitive. Throwing a punch simply didn't fit the Vulcan's calm demeanor or refined discipline. So, Nimoy proposed something entirely different. What if Spock could render someone unconscious with a precise touch? A subtle maneuver delivered at the base of the neck, more elegant than aggressive, more mystical than martial. It was risky. No one had planned for such a move, and the effect had never been tested. But Nimoy believed in it. Now all he needed was Shatner to sell it. As the cameras rolled, Nimoy applied the imaginary technique, and Shatner reacted with the perfect dramatic fall, selling the concept with a theatrical flair that made it feel instantly real. The crew watched, intrigued. The moment felt different. It felt Vulcan. What began as an improvised alternative soon became a defining feature of Spock's character. The Vulcan nerve pinch was used throughout the series and carried over into films and spin-offs, cementing its place in pop culture. Fans were captivated by the move's mysterious nature. Was it neurological, spiritual, a blend of both? The show never explained it in detail, and that only deepened its intrigue. Nimoy's insight didn't just add a gesture to the show, it added a philosophy. The nerve pinch wasn't about domination or brute strength. It reflected restraint, intelligence, and efficiency. It told the audience that Spock's power didn't come from his fists, it came from his mind. The fact that it wasn't in the script at all makes it even more remarkable. It's a perfect example of how Star Trek thrived when its actors were allowed to shape their characters, when creativity was welcomed, and when instinct took precedence over formula. With one improvised gesture, Nimoy redefined what it meant to be strong and gave fans a moment they'd never forget. Terry Garr's silent regret. In the sprawling galaxy of Star Trek guest stars, few have remained as silent about their time on the show as Terry Garr, and that silence speaks volumes. Before she became a breakout star in Tootsie and Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Garr appeared in the Star Trek episode Assignment Earth. She played Roberta Lincoln, a spirited young woman caught in a time travel plot alongside Gary Seven, a mysterious character played by Robert Lansing. The episode was originally conceived as a backdoor pilot for a potential spin-off series. It featured Garr in a prominent role, intended to carry over into that imagined show. But the spin-off never materialized, and Garr's relationship with Star Trek essentially ended there. What's notable isn't just that Garr never returned to the franchise, it's how little she's ever said about it. While most guest stars have happily recalled their experiences, shared stories at conventions, or embraced their connection to the Star Trek universe, Garr remained unusually distant. In interviews, she's made passing comments about the experience being uncomfortable, even hinting that certain aspects of her time on set were unpleasant enough to avoid revisiting entirely. Behind the scenes, rumors swirled about why Garr distanced herself. Several accounts suggest that Gene Roddenberry's behavior toward her crossed professional boundaries. Known for his charm and occasional lack of discretion, Roddenberry had a reputation for becoming too personal with certain female cast members. While Garr has never confirmed the details, her decision to avoid discussing the role has led many to believe that the experience left her disillusioned. What makes her silence so striking is its contrast to the norm. Many actors who had brief appearances on Star Trek still look back with affection, citing the show's legacy and the fandom's enduring love. But Garr, who by all rights could have become a recurring figure in the franchise, chose distance instead. Even in retrospectives and Star Trek documentaries, her absence is noticeable. It's not just that she declined to appear, it's that her name rarely comes up at all. For fans who dig deeper, that void becomes a quiet mystery. A moment in Star Trek history that could have launched a new chapter instead became a closed book. Sometimes the stories that aren't told say the most. And in the case of Terry Garr, the silence surrounding her experience suggests a side of Star Trek history that isn't celebrated, but isn't forgotten either. The uniforms came from a sweatshop. They looked sharp on camera, clean lines, bold colors, a vision of the future. The Starfleet uniforms worn in Star Trek. The original series became some of the most iconic costumes in science fiction history. But the truth behind those crisp tunics and command insignias was far less polished. Behind the scenes was a story that exposed the harsh realities of a broken industry. When production on Star Trek began in the mid-1960s, budget constraints were constant. The studio demanded cinematic quality with a television budget, and that pressure extended to wardrobe. Costume designer William Thies was tasked with creating uniforms that looked futuristic but remained cost-effective. So, to stretch the show's limited funds, many of the costumes were sourced through a small, under-the-radar sewing operation in Los Angeles. That workshop, according to several crew accounts, wasn't just low budget, it was operating outside legal boundaries. Described by insiders as a non-union sweatshop, the facility used underpaid labor, often in poor conditions, to mass-produce wardrobe pieces for film and television. While details about its operations were kept quiet at the time, whispers of its involvement have lingered in Hollywood lore. The irony is sharp. A show that presented a utopian future where inequality had been eradicated and dignity extended to all relied on exploitative labor practices rooted in the inequalities of its own era. The symbolism didn't go unnoticed by those on set. Some wardrobe assistants and costumers expressed discomfort with where the uniforms came from, but changing suppliers wasn't feasible given the tight shooting schedules and even tighter budgets. The situation reflected a broader truth about 1960s Hollywood. Many productions, not just Star Trek, cut corners in ways that wouldn't hold up today. Labor laws were more loosely enforced, and ethical sourcing was rarely a priority, especially when working on the edge of cancellation, as Star Trek often was. Over time, as the franchise grew in popularity and funding increased, costume production shifted to more regulated and professional settings. But those early uniforms remain a sobering reminder that even the most visionary storytelling can be stitched together with threads of compromise. It's a part of Star Trek's legacy that doesn't fit cleanly into the optimistic narrative, and yet, acknowledging it deepens our understanding of what it took to bring the future to life. The uniforms may have promised equality, but they were born in a world still struggling to achieve it. The fans who saved Star Trek. It wasn't alien invaders or malfunctioning warp drives that nearly brought down the Enterprise. It was cancellation. After just 2 seasons, NBC decided to end Star Trek. Ratings were lukewarm, executives were unimpressed, and the show's future looked bleak. But what happened next would rewrite the rules of what fan power could accomplish. As word spread that NBC intended to cancel Star Trek, a small but passionate group of fans took action. Spearheaded by B.G.O. Trimble and her husband John, fans began an unprecedented letter-writing campaign aimed directly at NBC executives. But these weren't your typical complaint letters. They were heartfelt, well-organized, and relentless. Tens of thousands of letters flooded the network. Some came from students, others from scientists, teachers, and families. They spoke of how Star Trek inspired them, challenged them, and gave them hope. The fans didn't just want more television. They wanted a future worth imagining. NBC executives were stunned. They'd never seen anything like it. What made the campaign even more remarkable was its coordination. Fans printed newsletters, made phone calls, and mobilized entire communities, all in an era long before the internet. It was pure grassroots determination, fueled by love for a show that dared to be different. The movement gained traction, and soon national media began covering the uprising of what some called Trekkies. Back on set, the cast and crew watched in amazement. William Shatner later recalled how stunned he was to see the volume of support. Leonard Nimoy, deeply touched, praised the fans for believing in the show's message even when the suits in charge didn't. The support wasn't just morale boosting, it changed the network's decision. NBC reversed course and renewed Star Trek for a 3rd season. The show's budget was reduced and its time slot pushed to a challenging hour, but it survived. More importantly, It was the first major television series to be saved entirely by its audience, a legacy that has influenced everything from science fiction to modern fan campaigns. The third season would be the show's last on air, for a time, but the seeds had been planted. The fandom that saved the show would go on to fuel reruns, conventions, movies, spin-offs, and an entire cultural phenomenon. They didn't just save a series, they launched a galaxy of stories that continue to this day. In the end, it wasn't a heroic captain or a logical Vulcan who saved Star Trek. It was the fans, ordinary people united by imagination who proved that stories about the future are worth fighting for. I Am Not Spock almost broke the bond. Few characters in science fiction are as beloved as Spock, the calm voice of logic, the arched eyebrow, the Vulcan salute. Leonard Nimoy didn't just play the role, he became synonymous with it. But when he published a book titled I Am Not Spock, it sparked a wave of confusion, disappointment, and even anger among fans who felt betrayed by the man they thought embodied the half-human, half-Vulcan they adored. Released in 1975, just a few years after Star Trek was canceled, Nimoy's memoir was intended as a reflection on the challenge of separating actor from role. He wanted to explore his broader career, his ambitions, and how being constantly identified as Spock limited his opportunities and personal identity. But the title alone sent a message far louder than the contents of the book. To fans, I Am Not Spock sounded like a rejection, a dismissal of the character who had inspired them, who represented hope, reason, and otherness all at once. The media amplified the controversy, and suddenly, a thoughtful meditation on identity was interpreted as disloyalty. Nimoy found himself facing backlash not just from fans, but also from within the industry. His relationship with Star Trek and its audience felt strained. Over the years, Nimoy began to clarify his intent. He never disliked Spock. In fact, he respected and even admired the character deeply. But the pressures of fame, typecasting, and personal growth had left him conflicted. Spock was a part of him, but not all of him. In 1995, 2 decades after the first memoir, Nimoy offered an emotional olive branch. He published I Am Spock, a follow-up that embraced the character with affection and grace. In the new book, Nimoy spoke about how Spock had become a lifelong companion, a voice in his head, a guide, even a friend. He acknowledged that time had changed his perspective and that fan loyalty had played a big part in helping him reconcile with the role. The second book didn't just repair his image, it deepened the connection between Nimoy and his audience. It showed humility, evolution, and a willingness to embrace the weight of cultural legacy. Fans responded with renewed admiration, and Nimoy became more than an actor who once played Spock. He became Spock in spirit as well. This chapter of his life reminds us that identity is fluid. The very message of Star Trek, about understanding, growth, and unity, was echoed in Nimoy's own journey. In the end, he didn't reject Spock. He just needed time to truly understand him. Harry Mudd's lost stardom. Among the many characters to appear on Star Trek, the original series, few stood out quite like Harcourt Fenton Mudd. Loud, flamboyant, and morally flexible, Harry Mudd was the kind of rogue who brought chaos and comedy wherever he went. Played with theatrical glee by Roger C. Carmel, Mudd appeared in only 2 episodes during the show's original run. But that was enough to make a lasting impression. In fact, his popularity almost earned him something no other guest character received: his own spin-off. In the late 1960s, NBC was exploring new ways to capitalize on Star Trek's modest but growing fan base. Executives saw something unique in Mudd. Unlike the disciplined, mission-focused crew of the Enterprise, Mudd was unpredictable. His stories leaned towards satire and farce, often clashing with the show's more serious tone. But viewers remembered him and laughed along with him. The idea of a Mudd-centric spin-off began to take shape. Carmel, a seasoned television actor with a booming voice and a flair for comedy, was reportedly enthusiastic about the prospect. Early development was discussed behind the scenes. The spin-off would likely follow Mudd's adventures across the galaxy, smuggling, scheming, and somehow always escaping disaster. It would have been a different flavor of science fiction, mischievous instead of moralistic, comedic instead of contemplative. But as quickly as the idea rose, it vanished. multiple factors contributed to the project's collapse. NBC grew increasingly disinterested in expanding Star Trek as its ratings plateaued. Budget concerns made any new series a tough sell. And behind the scenes, Carmel's relationship with producers became strained. Reports suggest salary disputes and reliability issues, including missed shooting days, cast a shadow over his reputation. By the time serious talks could happen, the network had already shifted focus. It was a missed opportunity for both actor and franchise. A Mudd spin-off could have been Star Trek's first comedic offshoot, predating later attempts to inject humor into the universe. Instead, Mudd faded into fan memory, reappearing only briefly in Star Trek, the animated series, and, decades later, reimagined in Star Trek Discovery. What remains is a fascinating what-if in the history of Star Trek. Had Harry Mudd gotten his own ship, his own crew, and his own slice of the galaxy, the franchise might have taken a bold and hilarious detour. Instead, he became a colorful footnote, a reminder that even in a universe filled with possibility, not every orbit gets a second revolution. They showed us a future where peace triumphed over conflict and curiosity outpaced fear. But behind the calm professionalism of the Enterprise bridge was a crew navigating storms of their own, conflicts, sacrifices, and moments of doubt that never made it to the screen. The cast of Star Trek gave us more than performances. They offered reflections of real human struggle, growth, and redemption. Which of these behind-the-scenes stories changed the way you see the crew? Drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your favorite untold truth. If you enjoyed this voyage through Starfleet's hidden history, don't forget to like and subscribe. More cinematic secrets are just over the horizon. Because the final frontier wasn't just space, it was human, fragile, complex, and endlessly bold. And those who shaped Star Trek didn't just imagine the future, they lived through trials that proved why it was worth dreaming of in the first place.